As I mentioned in our meditation, tonight is the anniversary of 9/11, and I think that all of us remember where we were that day and what we were doing. It was pretty much embedded in our mind, the disbelief as we saw the images of the Twin Towers and the maybe sickening feeling that we had. I know a friend of mine, I remember, called me from the Midwest. She knew I was in Virginia near Washington, D.C., and she called to ask if I was okay. Like being in Charlottesville was in the line of danger. It was just a memory that I have, one of the memories I have of that day. I think you can't hear. Thank you for letting me know. How's that? Is that better? As I said earlier today, we are getting a new mic, but okay. Maybe I'll just hold it. So I think that, better? Okay. I think that 9/11 is something of a marker in our history. That there's been since then been a growing factor of fear and distrust in our society. I think our national mood has gotten darker since 9/11. There's a greater sense of insecurity or danger. And we don't have to look far just to think about all the things that have been happening. I mean, the shooting in Aurora, Colorado. For us to know that, we don't feel as safe, I think, as we used to. We have a new term in our national vocabulary, and that is domestic terrorism. And I think there are a lot of things that we as a nation, people living in it, are uncomfortable about, and with good reason. Global issues. Now, you may not think there's global warming. There's debate on whether there's global climate change. Let's call it global climate change. But something seems to be happening, and a lot of people think that, wow, things are changing with the climate, and the ice caps are melting. A lot of issues there. And what about our growing human population? Will be something like 9 billion in a few decades. A recognition of the limitations of our globe's, our planet's resources. Extinction of species. We can go on and on. I think we would all love to live in a time of optimism or a time when we feel things are getting better. But there's so much that seems quite ominous. I think that we are truly living in a time when the fear factor has escalated. The Chinese, maybe you've heard it, have a curse traditionally, and they say with an edge, "May you live in interesting times." We do. We definitely do. We live in interesting times, and times that can be very scary as well. And the truth is, the external issues are only half the picture for us, because we all have our internal fears as well. Every being has them. And they may be something as deep or something as easily pinpointed as like a fear of public speaking or whatever your particular fears are. A relative just recently told me that she's afraid of birds of all kinds. Yes, I mean we all have a variety of them. Some of us have deep fear of certain people. Fear, it is ingrained in us. Some of them are long-standing, and some are situational. So tonight, what I want to do is to talk about fear. I want to talk about fear and our spiritual practice. And I'm not going to speak about any one specific fear. I'm not going to talk about content of fear, but I'd like to talk about how do we work with fear in our spiritual practice. And going to be illustrating this with one of my own fearful experiences. And I'm going to be doing that because at least I'll say that for me, I learn best through personal experience. I'm not trying to tell you that I know everything about dealing with fear and that I'm doing it as a master. But by golly, this was a real teaching experience for me, a real learning experience. So this happened a few years ago. A few years ago, I learned that the house right across, directly across from my driveway, I live on a corner. And one side faces a quiet street, and the other side faces River Road, which is also quiet, but a little bit wider and more public. And right across the street from on River Road, facing my driveway in the back, I found out that a church was sponsoring a halfway house there. And that there were going to be, I don't know, something like 6 to 8 men moving in who had been in prison, had been released, and now they were going to be in this halfway house in an effort to get them settled, give them a place to live. Hopefully, they would be able to get jobs. And the church was requiring also that they attend church regularly. And the whole thing was a wonderful, wonderful effort, very compassionate. And I got to tell you, I wasn't happy about it. I heard that this was going to be happening, and I felt fear. And I have to say that a lot of these men, I was told, were former drug addicts. That had been their offense. That's why they were put in prison to begin with. And of course, I knew that there was no way to guarantee that they really were off of drugs, that they were clean. And I will say that, I have worked in prisons before, both men's prison and women's prison. And it's not just the idea of working with prisoners that was a problem. That's not a problem. But the idea that these guys were in a halfway house right across, really practically my own living room. They were just right across the street. This was unsettling. So more unsettling was that shortly after they moved in, I found some syringes in shrubs right near the house. So I said, this really was pretty scary. So turning from that particular fear to our spiritual practice, fear can be so pervasive, both in our nation, in our society, in our own lives, that we can begin to feel like it is natural, like it's the way things simply are, the way they need to be. And of course, we know there always has been fear, not only in human lives, but in the lives of even the smallest creatures. You ever pick up a worm that is out on a pavement and put it in the grass? It squirms, it writhes. Every being wants to preserve and protect its own life. Fear helps it do that. So to an extent, fear enables us to live as a species. But ongoing fear is toxic. Both physically, it's bad for the body, it damages the body, and psychologically. Psychologically, when we're dominated by fear, we feel separate. We feel isolated. We feel separate not only from others, but from ourselves. We become driven by our fear. And I'll say, certainly to some extent, with this experience of the halfway house right across from my driveway, I certainly felt fear coming up quite a lot. Fear can stalk us. And that was kind of what was happening for me. Our spiritual practice, though, means that we need to learn to deal with fear, to face our fears. This is the Buddha's teaching. It's really about what the Dharma means teaching, is about. That is, it's about moving into a place that's beyond the fear or deeper than the fear, a place of where there is no separation, a place of non-separation, a place of equanimity and openness and kindness, where we're no longer separated, in fact, from ourselves to begin with. you could say, the place where we have come to rest in our true nature. That's the point. That's the direction. And that's what we keep in mind as we practice. We don't often perhaps feel that we're there, but this is the direction. As spiritual practitioners, we all have a choice. And the choice is to live driven by fear or to work with fear, facing it so that we can move beyond it. And this is what the Sufi poet Hafiz had in mind. I want to read a poem that he wrote. He lived in the 12th century Persian poet. He wrote a poem called To Build a Swing. He said, "You carry all the ingredients to turn your life into a nightmare. Don't mix them. You have all the genius to build a swing in your backyard for God. That sounds like a hell of a lot more fun. Let's start laughing, drawing blueprints, gathering our talented friends. I will help you with my divine lyre and drum. Hafiz will sing 1,000 words you can take into your hands like golden saws, silver hammers, polished teakwood, strong silk rope. You carry all the ingredients to turn your existence into joy. Mix them. Mix them." So turning our existence into joy, it is our choice which direction we want to go. And you know, the Buddha said the same thing, using very different words, but he said the same thing. The Buddha spoke, he said the first noble truth, the first truth that simply prevails is that there is suffering in life. Doesn't mean life is always suffering, but it exists. And I would like us to notice that fear is suffering, isn't it? Fear hurts. No one feels good feeling fear. And his point was to end suffering, which means also, we could say in our terms right now, to end fear. Fear can make our life into the nightmare that Hafiz is talking about. So, the Buddha, talking about ending fear, and he noticed that often what we do is we expand on our suffering, and in this case, we can say we expand on our fear. He talked about 2 arrows. We've discussed this several times here. He said, you know, when we experience something that is unpleasant in our life, something we don't want, it's like we're shot with an arrow. Being shot with that first arrow is almost unavoidable in life. There are always unpleasant situations that arise sometimes in life. He said, but what we do is we tend to shoot ourselves with the second arrow. And the second arrow is the arrow of our minds, the process of our minds that go over and over and over and elaborate on our fears. You ever notice that with yourself? Mm-hmm. You know, think about it and think about it again and then again and again. We keep thinking about our fears. That's the second arrow. That's where we have a choice. We don't have to shoot ourselves with the second arrow. But in order to not shoot ourselves with the second arrow, we need to become aware that we're even doing it. Mm-hmm. So going back to my story, continuing with that, the halfway house. I shot myself. I was doing a lot of what I call second arrowing. And I felt like a hostage in my house. I was so aware that, you know, these guys lived right across the street from my driveway. They could see me if they wanted, anytime I went in and went out. And I thought, what that might mean, you know. And I taught or came to IMCC a lot at night, and would come home at night, and I started thinking, oh, you know, if somebody's watching my movements, they could see what nights I'm going every Tuesday night, coming home at a certain time. And then I started thinking, I thought somebody could hide behind a corner of my house, a particular corner, and I started looking for someone to step out of that from behind that corner. And I had a plan, about how I'd turn on the headlights, how I'd honk the horn. I had all kinds of plans. I even thought about getting mace. I never did, but I thought I would do that. So I had a whole plan going on about what I would do. And my mind also went on and thought, they could break in. Well, why not? And then I saw, I could see the Daily Progress having a headline, local meditation teacher murdered in her living room, something like that. I really went on big time on this particular thing. So I'd say I was second arrowing. So that brings us back to this question about mixing the ingredients of joy that Hafiz talks about. How do we do that? How do we do that in our spiritual practice? And the answer is we have to learn to embrace our fear, to move into our fear. What does that mean? Well, first of all, it means to notice that it's there. And so often, don't we just kind of put things in the background? And there we are going around with a heavy heart and a constriction in our body, and we're just kind of plowing through the day. I was doing some of that when this halfway house was there. We have to notice, be honest, and recognize that it's there. And then notice when the mind thoughts are second arrowing, when we're shooting ourselves again with what hasn't happened, but we're building on it, elaborating on it. That's the first thing. Notice, be mindful. And the second thing that we need to do is notice how fear is expressing in your body. I certainly was noticing it. I was noticing my heart and my belly. I was feeling tense sometimes in my jaws. It wasn't always the same, but it was always a really strong expression in my body. And then thirdly, moving into the fear, embracing the fear. And what does that mean? It means, on one level, do whatever you can on the external level to take care of the problem if there is a problem there. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's something from long, long ago that's still driving us. And secondly, it means when you notice fear in your body, be kind to it. Notice where it is. Notice the location and how it feels. And be kind. Give it kindness. Speak kindly to it. You can say and call it, give it an endearment. Hello, little one. It is. It's like a little orphan within you, isn't it? A little hurt being that's really trying to help you, protect you. Say you've been wronged or that you're in danger. Be kind to it instead of turning your back on it or ignoring it. Hello, little one. I see you there. And I'm standing there right with you. Doesn't mean I have to act out of you and act in a fearful way, but I see you. So those are the 3 steps. Noticing, including noticing second arrowing, and then seeing how it's expressing in the body, and being kind to it. So going back to my story of the halfway house, my own fears came to a head one night. It was, in fact, the night I had come home from IMCC on a Tuesday night, drove into my driveway, and I did not mention, this halfway house had no supervisor. These guys were mentoring themselves. There was one man who was the senior guy. I don't know why he was senior. He'd been there longer or been in prison longer. I don't know what qualified him to be senior, but he was the senior guy. He was the only, you might say, on-premise supervisor. This was not reassuring to me. Anyway, I drove home that night from IMCC and stopped the car, and all of a sudden there he was standing right next to me. I hadn't seen him. He must have been when I drove in, standing back by the bushes when I drove in, so it meant he had kind of noticed when I was coming home. And he was there, and he was angry. He was cursing. And I remember my legs started shaking. I didn't really stop to look anywhere else in my body to see where there's heart in my belly or wherever my legs were shaking. And he didn't walk up until I opened the door. So I said, "What are you doing here?" Something like, "What are you doing here?" And he was just kind of cursing and telling me that he couldn't get into the house. He's halfway, not my house, his house. That nobody was opening the door. He was very angry with it, so angry that it wasn't a rational situation. And I was scared. And I noticed that my voice started shaking too. And so I said, "Okay." I said, "I'll call the pastor." I had her phone number. "I'll call the pastor. You go over to your house, wait there. I'll come back and tell you." At least I had the presence of mind to say that. And I got out quickly and went into the house, closed the door, locked it, and called the pastor. And he did go back over, still cursing. In fact, loudly cursing. He was shouting. So I called. Fortunately, she was home. I got her, and I was so relieved when I heard her voice on the other end of the phone, and I explained the situation, and she was upset too. She said, "He knows he's not supposed to be on your property." Great. She said, "I'll be right over." So I was very relieved. I went out, I told him that, and then I scurried back in and locked the door again, and I was scared. But that experience kind of brought this to a head for me. It made me really face my fears. Now, first of all, I wouldn't say that any of this felt like I was mixing the ingredients of joy, right? This is far from that. But I started to face it. So I called the pastor. She went over. She talked to him. And then I did some other things. I took some other actions. Secondly, I had a security alarm set up in my house. So I thought, I don't know, maybe that'll make me feel a little bit safer. It did make me feel a little safer, though I have to say I never use it. But anyway, in fact, I don't like it. It's kind of, anyway, I don't want to go in my relationship with my security alarm. But it's there. It's not a good one. But it was there, and on the outside, it looks really impressive, I guess. So I had a security alarm installed. But as far as I was concerned, you know what? That wasn't really enough. And I realized I needed to face it even more directly. So what I did was I called the pastor, and I offered to teach a mindfulness course at church for these guys in the halfway house and anybody else who wanted to come. And that in itself was a bit of a scary proposition, because I thought, first of all, I'll tell you, this is an evangelical church. And I thought, she's going to think I'm Satan, even suggesting, to offer this. It's like, but she didn't. She thought it was a good idea. I explained to her what mindfulness is, and that, when we are stressed, and these guys in the halfway house, no doubt, were really stressed, mindfulness can be a tremendous help to them. So I convinced her because she said yes. So I did. I started a short course, I think it was 4 or 5 weeks of a mindfulness course. There weren't a lot of people there, and there were only a couple of guys from the halfway house. And there were a couple of people from the church, and the pastor, she came. That for me was so important. I mean, I felt, what can I say, empowered. I felt relieved. I was facing it. I was facing some of these guys, not all of the guys, but some of them. And it's like I moved right into the heart of my fear. And I'll say that those who were there, it was a really interesting experience for me, and I think for them too. The pastor loved it. There was one session where she turned around to everybody and she said, "Listen," she said, "I want you all to know that Jesus talked about mindfulness in the Bible." This is really good. So, as I said, I felt like I had really faced my fear, and I had done as much as I can. I felt a tremendous weight lift off of me, even though, as I said, it wasn't rational. Certainly not everybody in that house, all the residents came. And moreover, the residents were constantly turning over. There were new people in and out. And yet, somehow or another, it felt like, oh, everything is going to be okay. And I have to say, still, I was glad when several months later I found out that the halfway house moved out. The church decided they were not going to continue that effort in that place. And I think I learned afterwards they didn't continue at all. It was too much of it was a bigger project than they had anticipated. But there were some nice other little results as a result of that. And that was shortly after that evening when this man, who was the quote-unquote supervisor on their property, had come to me shouting. A couple of days later, I'd been outside. I was working in my garden, trimming some hedges or something, and I saw him. And I turned to him and I said, "How did it work out the other night?" And he said, "It worked out just fine." He said, and, we were talking like two human beings to each other. I think he had no idea how scared I had been. But that went really very nicely. And also, sometime after that course, the pastor emailed me and she said, "I've been practicing mindfulness." She said, "I think you were a gift from God." Isn't that sweet? Yeah. So facing and moving into, embracing fear, it really made a difference. And, another factor, though, I would like to say is after all of that had happened, I thought about that night when this man had walked into my yard, and I was disappointed that I had been so scared. Like many of us, I think, after we practice for a while, we want to think we have that ace, We'd love to be fearless, wouldn't you? Doesn't it sound great? And we talk about our practice as being developing fearlessness. Well, I don't really know, maybe my limited range of people that I know, but I don't know anybody who's fearless. And I don't think that it is necessary, or even, shall I say it, this is just my own opinion, I wonder if anybody ever is fearless. Now, I know that in the Buddhist scriptures we hear about the Buddha being fearless, and I'm not going to dispute it, though I kind of wonder when that drunk elephant, and he was drunk, he was made drunk, charged him down the road, and the Buddha simply stood there. I've often thought about that. Really? He was utterly fearless? Well, it said that he simply offered loving kindness, and the elephant stopped in front of him and bowed, and maybe that happened that way. But anyway, he may have been fearless. Certainly I recognize that I, and everyone else I know, we're not fearless. And spiritual practice means getting real, embracing what's really true for you. And if in the moment that's fear, that's what's spiritual, to notice it. You see, we tend to think, I'm so unspiritual. I'm sitting here and my legs are shaking, I'm scared. This is unspiritual. No. What is spiritual is about being real. Once we can acknowledge and embrace what's true for you in the moment, that's the place of spirituality. Embracing truth, because you see, that embrace means that you have grown bigger than whatever the emotion is that's gripping you. Can you see that? Rather than being just twisted around by fear or any of the other afflictive emotions, anger or jealousy or bitterness or whatever else it may be, rather than being just twisted by it, you've grown bigger than it. And you can hold it in a place that gets close to equanimity, close to an unconditioned place. So we, as the Buddha said, we have a bigger container in which to hold that which is true. That's what it's about. So rather than thinking that we're going to get rid of fear or anger, yes, these things we do work with. And we can indeed be very wonderfully surprised sometimes when our conditioned reactions, say it's anger or hatred or fear or whatever it is, no longer arise in the same way or with the same intensity. But when in fact there's a glimmer, not to worry. Simply embrace it, and embracing it with kindness. So, in conclusion, I'd love to read this beautiful poem by Hafiz again, To Build a Swing. You carry all the ingredients to turn your life into a nightmare. Don't mix them. You have all the genius to build a swing in your backyard for God. That sounds like a hell of a lot more fun. Let's start laughing, drawing blueprints, gathering our talented friends. I will help you with my divine lyre and drum. Hafiz will sing 1,000 words you can take into your hands like golden saws, silver hammers, polished teakwood, strong silk rope. You carry all the ingredients to turn your existence into joy. Mix them, mix them. So, thank you.